I'm joined now by Lynsey Chutel. She's the Johannesburg correspondent for Quartz, a digital news outlet. So, Lynsey, will Zuma actually respond to his party's request to step down by Wednesday? Has anything changed in his mind?
Well, as far as we know, not much seems to have changed. It's been difficult to guess what President Jacob Zuma is saying. We've seen a lot of fake news characterizing this entire so-called transition, as the ANC calls it. Just about, I think, half an hour ago, we all received a message saying that the president has called a briefing at the union buildings in the capital, Pretoria, and of course that caused a lot of frenzy. Turns out it was dismissed as fake news. A couple of days earlier, we had similar reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin was flying in to assist Zuma, an old ally of his. That was also dismissed as fake news. And I think what that tells us is that there's so much uncertainty happening in South Africa now. There's a massive information vacuum despite today's despite today's announcement from the African National Congress. So South Africans are kind of lurching from one announcement to the next. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of muted excitement and then disappointment. And I was downtown this afternoon and people saw all the buzz around the African National Congress's main office, but they just went on with their lives, because I think that this has just been a really, someone once called it, a really long episode of House of Cards.
Now, I want to get to the people of South Africa in just a moment, but you know, the ANC is looking at the bigger picture here. It's political survival. So if Zuma steps down, will that help them in the next elections?
Well, that's exactly what they seem to be thinking with this. It's why they've asked him eventually to step down. President Jacob Zuma has been a bit of a blight on the reputation of the African National Congress. It's gone from being the party of Nelson Mandela and South Africa's premier liberation movement. Now it's become a party that has been caught up in a series of corruption scandals. But the other thing is that even if President Jacob Zuma leaves, a lot of South Africans are feeling, and voters, given that next year is an election year, that this is the same ANC that for the last 10 years didn't exactly stop President Jacob Zuma's corruption scandals. They didn't recall him, they didn't discipline him. We saw it over and over, whether it was with his massive palatial compound in Nkandla and KwaZulu-Natal, whether he was allowing his friends to use a military airbase for a wedding reception. And the African National Congress never stepped in. They didn't pull out the disciplinary action that we're seeing now. Instead, they all lined up, the very same ministers lined up and defended him. So the African National Congress is going to have to work really hard to convince the African voters that they are a different party, and I think that's where Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa comes in. He wants to be president. He's made it quite clear. He's now the head of the African National Congress already, and he's the man who is seen as leading the negotiations to get President Jacob Zuma to step down. He's making all sorts of promises to the South African public, apart from the fact that he's promised to finalize this. He also says that South Africa will finally get over what he calls a very traumatic time.
And that being said, you mentioned the chaos. So what has been the mood on the streets among South Africans as this chaos, as you mentioned, continues to play out? Are people ready for a change?
I think people are certainly ready for a change. The thing is, with this particular episode of chaos, is that it is the latest in what has been a series of episodes with President Jacob Zuma's chaos. Starting a few years ago with, as I mentioned, his Nkandla compound, where everybody heard about this massive amounts of taxpayer money and the scandal, and you know, there was no real answer coming out of that, but everybody saw this big building coming up. And then again, this massive scandal, but no real answer. And so South Africans have kind of gotten used to this level of scandal that comes with President Jacob Zuma. The same thing when he fired the finance minister late one Sunday night with no warning. So what he's done is that he's created this level of chaos in South Africa where South Africans acknowledge that they're frustrated. They call into radio stations, they mention it on TV, social media as a buzz. But at the end of the day, though, it doesn't translate to protests, because there's also, just as much as there is frustration, there's also quite a bit of fatigue.
All right, Lynsey Chutel in Johannesburg, thank you so much. We appreciate it.